Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stuns Lex Fridman on his views on God in this 2.5 hour long podcast. This is his most viral clip. If you like this type of content, my name is Aaron. I do Christian commentary on culture. Please hit the like and subscribe and bell, and let's get right into this video without wasting any time. Let's get right into it.
About God, you wrote, God talks to human beings through many vectors: wise people, organized religion, the great books of religions, through art, music, and poetry. But nowhere with such detail and grace and joy as through creation. When we destroy nature, we diminish our capacity to sense the divine. What is your relationship, and what is your understanding of God? Who is God?
Well, I mean, God is incomprehensible. I guess the most philosophers would say we're inside the mind of God. And so it would be impossible for us to understand, what God's form is. But I mean, for me, I have let's say this. I was raised in a very, very deeply religious setting. So we went to church in the summer, oftentimes twice a day, morning mass, and we definitely went every Sunday, and we prayed in the morning, we prayed before and after every meal, we prayed at night, we said a rosary, sometimes 3 rosaries a night, and my father read us the Bible. Whenever he was home, he would read us, we'd all get in the bed and he'd read us the Bible stories. I went to Catholic schools, I went to Jesuit schools, I went to the nuns, and I went to a Quaker school at one point. When I became a drug addict when I was about 15 years old, about a year after my dad died, and I was addicted to drugs for 14 years. During that time, when you're an addict, you're living against conscience. And when you're living, and I never, I was always trying to get off of drugs, never able to, but I never felt good about what I was doing. And when you're living against conscience, you kind of push God to the peripheries of your life. So I'll call me he, recedes and gets smaller. And then when I got sober, I knew that I had a couple of experiences. One is that I had a friend of my brother's, one of my brothers who died of this disease of addiction, had a good friend who had used to take drugs with us, and he became a Moonie. So he became a follower of Reverend Sun Young Moon. And at that point, his compulsion, he had the same kind of compulsion that I had, and yet it was completely removed from him. And he used to come and hang out with us, but he would not want to take drugs, even if I was taking them right in front of him. He was immune to it. He'd become impervious to that impulse. And when I first got sober, I knew that I did not want to be the kind of person who was, waking up every day and white knuckling sobriety and just, trying to resist through willpower. And by the way, I had iron willpower as a kid. I gave up candy for Lent when I was 12, and I didn't eat it again until I was in college. I gave up desserts the next year for Lent, and I never ate another dessert till I was in college, and I was trying to bulk up for rugby and for sports. So I felt like I could do anything with my willpower, but somehow this particular thing, the addiction, was completely impervious to it. And it was cunning, baffling, incomprehensible. I could not understand why I couldn't just say no and then never do it again like I did with everything else. So I was living against conscience.
So really quick, I want to just highlight 2 things. But as far as background, he was charged with possession of heroin, and then he was put in probation for 2 years in 1984. But there were 2 things that I found very fascinating, and I'm not sure if what I what you think about them. And the first thing was his phrase of living against conscience. And then the second one was his understanding of willpower. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is willpower. I cannot make an equal, comparison between drugs and sweets and candy. He said, like, I could stop sweets and no problem. I could stop candy and desserts, no problem. But for some reason, drugs. To me, that's not even in the same hemisphere, right? That's not even the same thing. But what I really want to hone in on is his understanding of that he doesn't want to white knuckle his way to sobriety. Rather, is that this understanding of willpower is actually he knows that he thought he had iron willpower until he had to put it to the test. When things become easy, you don't really need power. When that desire is lifted from you and taken away from you totally, you don't need that willpower, because willpower is exhausting. It drains your endurance. We think that, all these like gurus on YouTube, like with the discipline and, willpower, and it's not that easy. And no one holds themselves. No one can have infinite discipline and infinite willpower. It's ridiculous. And because I think that people's convenience have a much more prominent role in their lives than their discipline and willpower in general. But I know for a fact that no one has unlimited willpower, unlimited discipline, and I think he understands that for himself. And the number two thing is he mentioned was this phrase, I was living against conscience. And for me, I'm going to interpret conscience as this ability to be self-aware, right? Self-aware, and you are living against that. And how that's flushed out is that you are living against things like what you are self-aware is right. So you're living against your morals. You're living against your standards that you would set for other people and you'd set for yourself. And you're living against your potential. And this is probably the most important one, because God made you for a purpose and a plan, and he made you with worth and intrinsic value. And that when you're living against conscience, when you are enslaved by a drug, you are now living against all those things that you are, all those things that he was raised as a Catholic, and all these things that he understands as moral and right, and he knows he is better than. He is living against all of that. And I think that's just something that's telling of someone who is struggling with addiction. And so my heart goes out to a lot of people who have that in their inner turmoil within themselves. Like, I know what I'm doing is wrong, and I am not living up to my potential, and yet I still continue to do this. Paul mentions this in Romans 7, like things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't do, I don't want to do, I do. And so it's one of those, internal human struggles that we all deal with, and that we don't have infinite willpower. Let's just keep on going for the rest of this video.
And I thought about this guy, and reflecting my own prejudices at that time in my life, I said to myself, I didn't want to be like a drug addict who was wanting a drug all the time and just not being able to do it. I wanted to completely realign myself so that I was somebody who got up every day and just didn't want to take drugs, never thought of them. Kissed the wife and children and went to work and was never thought about drugs the whole day. And I knew that people throughout history had done that. I'd read the lives of the saints. I knew St. Augustine had been a very, very dissolute youth and had this spiritual realignment, transformation. I knew the same thing had happened to St. Paul, at Damascus. The same thing had happened to St. Francis. St. Francis also had a dissolute and fun-loving youth, and had this deep spiritual realignment. And I knew that had happened to people throughout history. And I thought that's what I needed, something like that. I had the example of this friend of mine, and I used to think about him, and I would think, and this again reflects the bias and the, probably the meanness of myself at that time, but I said I'd rather be dead than be a Mooney. But I wish I somehow could distill that power that he got without becoming a religious nuisance. And at that time, I picked up a book by Carl Jung called Synchronicity. And Jung, he was a psychiatrist. He was contemporary of Freud's. Freud was his mentor, and Freud wanted him to be his replacement, but Freud was an avowed atheist. And Jung was a deeply spiritual man. He had these very intense and genuine spiritual experiences from when he was a little boy, from when he was 3 years old, that he remembers. His biography is fascinating about him because he remembers them with such detail. And he was interesting to me because he was a very faithful scientist, and I considered myself a science-based person from when I was little. And yet he had this spiritual dimension to him, which infused all of his thinking and really, I think, made him, branded his form of recovery or of treatment. And he thought that he had this experience that he describes in this book, where he's sitting up on he ran one of the biggest sanitariums in Europe, in Zurich. And he was sitting up on the third floor of this building, and he's talking to a patient who was describing her dream to him. And the fulcrum of that dream was a scarab beetle, which was an insect that is very, very uncommon, if at all, in Northern Europe, but it's a common figure in the iconography of Egypt and the hieroglyphics on the walls of the pyramids, etc. And while he was talking to her, he heard this bing, bing, bing on the window behind him, and he didn't want to turn around to take his attention off her, but finally he does it. He, in exasperation, he turns around, he throws up the window, and a scarab beetle flies in and lands in his hand. And he shows it to the woman, and he says, "Is this what you were thinking of? Is this what you were dreaming about?" And he was struck by that experience, which was similar to other experiences he's had like that. And that's what synchronicity means. It's an instant, a coincidence, And like if you're talking with somebody about somebody that you haven't thought about in 20 years, and that person calls on the phone, that's synchronicity. Oh, and he believed it was a way that God intervened in our lives that broke all the rules of nature that he had set up, the rules of physics, the rules of mathematics, to reach in and sort of tap us on the shoulder and say, "I'm here." And
so when we're talking about, he's focusing on synchronicity and really spirituality, and this is the human need internally for searching for meaning and purpose in life. Okay, this is one of those internal struggles that we hate when we're doing meaningless things, or we hate when we see meaningless suffering. The best example I have is, you remember that Karate Kid movie where, he's doing wax on, Daniel's son is doing wax on, wax off, and he's just cleaning just like this all the time. And he finds no meaning in this. Like, why am I doing this? This is frustrating me. This is all meaningless, until, Mr. Miyagi says, "Okay, wax on." And he goes just like this. And he realized all of a sudden, like, all of what he thought was meaningless was now filled with meaning. It was now meaningful. Synchronicity means like what are seemingly random acts or random things that are happening to you that seemingly have no meaning, but actually from a God perspective have intense, deep, and eternal meaning. Sometimes we would see this as providence, even though providence has more of a providing, guarding, protecting nature to it. But moreover, that God is the authority over all creation, that there isn't one thing outside of his complete and utter authority and control, that you see the little dust motes in the air, that each one of those, this is John Piper, right? Each one of those move according to his divine command and will. And when we understand that there is actually intense, deep, eternal meaning in everything we do, especially suffering, we could make sense of that. We could justify that. We might not know exactly why, but we know that God isn't out to belittle us or embarrass us or punish us. Instead, rather, we have to find that meaning and purpose and value in all things we do. Okay, so let's keep on going to the most viral part.
And so he tried to reproduce that in a clinical setting. And he would put one guy in one room and another guy in another room and have them flip cards and guess what the other guy had flipped. And he believed that if he could beat the laws of chance, laws of mathematics, that he would have proved the existence of an unnatural law, a supernatural law. And that was the first step to proving the existence of a God. He never succeeds in doing it. But he says in the book, even though I can't prove using empirical and scientific tools the existence of a God, I can show through anecdotal evidence, having seen thousands of patients come through this institution, that people who believe in God get better faster and that the recovery is more enduring than people who don't. And for me, hearing that was more impactful than if he had claimed that he had proved the existence of a God, because I wouldn't have believed that. But I was already at a mindset where I would have done anything I could to improve my chances of never having to take drugs again by even 1%. And if believing in God was going to help me, whether there's a God up there or not, believing in one itself had the power to help me, I was going to do that. So then the question is, how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or hear or touch or taste or acquire with your senses? And Jung provides the formula for that. And he says, act as if, you fake it till you make it. And so that's, what I started doing. I just started pretending there was a God watching me all the time, and kind of life was a series of tests, and there was a bunch of moral decisions that I had to make every day. And each one, these were all just little things that I did, but each one now for me had a moral dimension. Like when when the alarm goes off, do I lay in bed for an extra 10 minutes with my indolent thoughts, or do I jump right out of bed? Do I make my bed? Most important decision of the day. Do I hang up the towels? Do I when I go into the closet and pull out my blue jeans and a bunch of those wire hangers fall on the ground, do I shut the door and say I'm too important to do that? That's somebody else's job, or not? And so, do I put the water in the ice tray before I put it in the freezer? Do I put the shopping cart back in the place that it's supposed to go in the parking lot of the Safeway? And if I make a whole bunch of those choices right, that I maintain myself in a posture of surrender, which keeps me open to the power to my higher power, to my God. And when I do those things right, when so much about addiction is about abuse of power, abuse of, all of us have some power, whether it's good looks, or whether it's connections or education or family or whatever. And there's always a temptation to use those to fulfill self-will. And the challenge is, how do you use those always to serve instead God's will and the good of our community? And that, to me, is kind of the struggle. And when I do that, I feel God's power coming through me, and that I can do things. I'm much more effective as a human being. That gnawing, anxiety that I lived with for so many years, and my God, it's gone, and that I can kind of like put down the oars and hoist the sail, and and the wind takes me, and I can see the evidence of it in my life.
So that is like such a beautiful way to put that. Like you're struggling against the waves and you're rowing this boat, and like God is here, and he's like the wind in your sails. You could put down the oars and he will take you wherever he needs to take you. Like I thought that one line that he said, and I don't know if it's a line or not, but I just thought that was very insightful and beautiful description of who God is in a lot of people's lives. I do want to bring up two additional things. The first one is what he said about, kind of fake it till you make it. Like if you don't feel like you are you love God or believe in God and think he's real, that Jung actually says, and he admits that he agrees to, that you fake it till you make it. And to an extent, I actually agree with this, especially if you're a Christian and you are falling out of love with God. Picture like you are a husband or a wife, and you have a spouse, and you stop loving them. Like in your heart, you feel so distant to them. But what if I'd take one of two roads. You either just, follow those feelings and like, I don't love him anymore, I'm not doing anything, I'm leaving. Or the second option is, I feel like I don't love him anymore, I'm not doing anything, but instead of like running away, I'm going to pretend and act like I am loving them. And in the act of the service of them, hey baby, how's your day? Care about them emotionally, invest in them, make dinner for them, clean the bathroom, all that stuff. You do all that stuff. That actually, the acts of those is actually very loving. It's the way to love them. Just because your feelings are obscure for a moment, that when you fake it till you make it, you actually save that relationship. And in that same vein, if you fall out of love with God, and belief is a little bit different, admittedly so, but if you feel like you don't love God anymore, you're so bored or whatever, that if you continue to do so, even if your feelings betray you, maybe you'll find that your faith is not your feelings, that your feelings are just a reaction or some momentary fleeting thing, and those feelings will come and go, but that in the actions of your life, that you are actually being very loving towards your spouse and your God. Now, the third thing I want to bring up, the second thing I want to bring up, is his view of morality. He's talking about morality in what I believe is the lowest sense of morality. He's talking about like bringing a shopping cart back to its place, or saying a nice thing, or doing this right, that did all these little more moral things that he's saying, like, I try to do every little one of these things because that's my morality. And I believe that is such a low bar for morality. I'll give you an example of why. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Jesus says, if you've heard it said that do not kill, but not just don't kill, or rather murder, rather just not that, but if you have hate in your heart, that's like committing that or breaking that commandment. And so what he's saying here is that even the thoughts, the inclination of wanting to kill somebody is sinful, is just like you trying to kill that person, right? Like his morality level, like RFK's morality level, is down to like some petty action of putting a cart back in the place, which I never do. So like, am I a bad person? I mean, maybe I'm a monster, right? But Jesus is saying, no, it's not just your physical action. It's actually the thought, right? Because you have your baseline action, like let's say do not murder, right? Do not murder. But then before you murder someone, maybe you have a plan and you say like, okay, I have a plan to murder someone. That's a sin too, right? And then let's say before the plan, you should decide like someone needs to murder that person. Well, that's a sin too. And then then down underneath, that is like that person deserves to die, to be murdered. I'm going to murder that person. All that stuff, all those things, all the way down. If you drill all the way down to the very start of your thoughts, that is sin as well. This is a technical term called concupiscence. However, I believe that his level of morality is extremely low. And so if you take his morality where God helps him accomplish those things, add that with synchronicity, I feel like you have this like pragmatic spirituality that serves him rather than is subservient and serves God. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are below. Let's wrap up this video, but let me know what you think about his view of morality. Is it too high, too low? Am I way off base? But let's finish this video off.
And the big thing for temptation for me is that when all these good things start happening in my life and the cash and prizes start flowing in, how do I maintain that posture of surrender? How do I stay surrendered then when my inclination is to say to God, thanks, God, I got it from here,
Yeah.
and drive the car off the cliff again? And so, I had a spiritual awakening, and my desire for drugs and alcohol was lifted miraculously. And to me, it was as much a miracle as if I'd been able to walk on water. Because I had tried everything earnestly, sincerely, and honestly for a decade to try to stop, and I could not do it under my own power. And then all of a sudden, it was lifted effortlessly. And, so I saw that evidence, early evidence of God in my life and of the power. And I see it now, every day of my life.
So adding that moral dimension to all of your actions is how you were able to win that Camus battle against the absurd.
Exactly.
Sisyphus with the boulder.
It's all the same thing. It's the battle to do the right thing.
And now
So I want to end on a good note and a challenging note, right? The first one is like the challenging note. Like I didn't hear any acknowledgement of, there's plenty of acknowledgement of sin, but there's no acknowledgement of like Jesus and salvation, dying on the cross, taking the punishment for him. I do, however, hear something very, very beautiful, and I heard like very pragmatic spirituality. However, I do hear something very, very poignant and powerful and beautiful from him, which is RFK certainly admits that he is powerless without God. And in his sense, he is powerless without God to overcome his battles with drugs and addiction. And that's just like a beautiful thing, because there's like a sense of humility there. There's a sense of surrender. There's a sense of trust that is all encompassing within just all that energy is directed towards God. Now, if we step back and we add that with the dimension of morality, like this high level morality, there's no way we could possibly accomplish that level of morality to where we are not deserving of hell anymore. And to that end, yeah, we are all very, very much in need of a loving Savior, a powerful God in our lives, and a Holy Spirit that strengthens us through it. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below, especially when my thoughts are about the morality. Like, is this too high or too low of morality for RFK Jr.? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Check out the other videos here, especially the one of Vivek Ramaswamy and Jordan Peterson.